In the bleak, frostbitten December of 1940, the destiny of Western civilization teetered on a knife's edge, unravelling with every passing hour. Above the English Channel, the Battle of Britain had been won. Spitfires and hurricanes tore through the clouds, defending the skies with precision and courage. Yet this aerial triumph offered little comfort to those below. Night after night, the Blitz descended like a relentless storm. London burned, sirens screamed through smoke-choked streets, warning citizens to huddle in subterranean shelters as incendiary bombs ignited entire neighbourhoods. The industrial hearts of Coventry, Liverpool and Manchester were hammered into rubble, their furnaces extinguished, their factories silenced. In the East End, Mrs. Elara Finch, a widow whose son was somewhere in North Africa, clutched her granddaughter in a damp Anderson shelter. The ground shook, and through a crack in the corrugated metal, she watched the crimson glow of her neighbourhood's funeral pyre reflect in the child's wide, unblinking eyes. This was not just war, it was the systematic incineration of a way of life. In Whitehall, deep below where the tremors were felt as a low, constant rumble, another kind of fire was being fought, one of ledgers, not Luftwaffe bombs. Across the globe, maps still depicted the British Empire as immense, a sprawling pink expanse covering a quarter of the earth. But in the shadowed war rooms beneath Whitehall, a grimmer reality held sway. Britain was not merely losing men, it was bleeding its very lifeblood, financially. Winston Churchill, whose speeches would ignite the courage of free peoples, sat hunched over a desk in the subterranean cabinet war rooms, quill in hand. He was drafting one of the most consequential letters of his life, a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States. The air was thick with cigar smoke and dread. Around him, aides moved like ghosts, their whispers punctuated by the distant thud of explosions. His hand, usually so firm, hovered for a moment. To ask was necessary, to beg was intolerable. He saw not the page before him, but the faces of the sailors on the Murmansk run, the fire watchers on London's roofs, the farmers ploughing around unexploded bombs. They were giving everything. Now he must admit that everything was not enough. The pen touched paper. "My dear Mr. President." It began not as a dispatch between statesmen, but as the confession of a drowning man seeing a single light on a distant shore. Churchill wielded language like a weapon, capable of forging words into swords. Yet this letter demanded a subtle art, the admission of weakness. He had to tell the leader of the world's wealthiest neutral power that Britain, the empire that had vanquished Napoleon, that had fueled the Industrial Revolution, that had once financed half the globe, was now entirely and completely bankrupt. The pages of the letter sprawled with meticulous detail. It outlined the shifting military landscape, the lurking menace of U-boats in the Atlantic, and Britain's desperate need for planes and destroyers. Yet the most piercing lines came at the conclusion. The Treasury's coffers were empty. Britain could fight on beaches, in fields and in cities, but it could no longer pay for the munitions required to survive. It was a plea for existence. It was, in essence, a confession. The proud empire was broke. To understand how the richest empire in history had reached the brink of financial ruin, one must confront the merciless economics of total war. In September 1939, when Hitler's forces surged across Poland and the world plunged into chaos, Britain still stood as a colossus of wealth. Billions of dollars shimmered in gold reserves. British hands controlled railways stretching across Argentina, copper mines deep in Chile, and sprawling industrial complexes in the United States. London's financial district, the city, pulsed as the beating heart of global insurance, shipping and trade. But Hitler's war was unlike any previous conflict. It was mechanized, consuming steel, oil, aluminum and rubber at rates that shattered every pre-war estimate. Factories spat out armaments and aircraft in relentless rhythm, while the countryside's raw materials disappeared almost overnight. Britain, critically, could not supply these resources itself. Nearly every vital commodity had to be imported. With continental Europe locked behind blockade and conquered by Nazi armies, the British lifeline stretched across the Atlantic to the still neutral United States. Yet neutrality meant caution. Memories of the First World War haunted the American psyche. Congress had passed neutrality laws to prevent another European entanglement, and the public, wary of another overseas bloodbath, demanded distance. One particular provision, known as cash and carry, dictated the terms of trade. Warring nations could purchase American goods, but they had to pay up front in cash and carry them away on their own ships. Credit was forbidden. Loans were impossible. For Britain, the consequences were immediate and dire. Its gold reserves, once a symbol of unassailable power, were steadily drained to pay for aircraft, tanks and raw materials. The physical removal of this wealth became an epic of silent desperation. In the vaults of the Bank of England, workers toiled by lantern light, loading ingots onto armoured trucks. Each bar, cold and impossibly dense, represented a squadron of Spitfires, 1,000 tons of wheat, a month of national hope. As the trucks rumbled through blacked-out streets to secret docks, their cargo was a nation's skeleton, being dug up and shipped away to pay for its skin. In a daring clandestine operation called Operation Fish, Britain's gold, along with transferable securities and other liquid assets, was loaded onto warships and fast liners, racing across the storm-tossed Atlantic to vaults in Canada. The shipments slipped through a deadly gauntlet of German U-boats, carrying not just currency, but the very lifeblood of the British war effort. It was the largest transfer of tangible wealth in human history, billions of dollars in motion, shrouded in secrecy. Aboard the cruiser HMS Emerald, sailors unaware of their cargo's true worth, felt the ship ride low and sluggish in the fierce Atlantic swell. They joked about lead ballast, but the atmosphere was taut. In the hold, secured behind steel doors, sat over £30 million in gold bullion. The ship's captain knew that a single torpedo would not just claim his crew, but would send the financial foundation of the Allied cause to the ocean floor, deeper than any salvage could reach. Every creak of the hull was a financial as well as a mortal terror. By the end of 1940, the reserves were gone. Britain's purchasing agents in Washington faced contracts they could not honour. The Treasury in London had no dollars to pay for the materials that could keep the nation alive. The empire, which had ruled oceans and commanded commerce for centuries, now found itself dependent, vulnerable, and teetering on the brink of insolvency. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt read Churchill's letter, he did not need advisers to explain its meaning. He understood instantly what was at stake. If Britain collapsed, if the last unconquered power in Western Europe fell, the Atlantic would no longer be a barrier. It would become a highway. The United States would stand alone against a hostile continent armed by Nazi industry. Britain was not merely an ally, it was the forward wall shielding America from the war. Yet Roosevelt faced a dilemma as formidable as any battlefield. He could not simply rescue Britain with money. American law forbade it. Public opinion resisted it. The scars of the First World War were still raw. Mothers remembered sons who never returned from European trenches. The nation was determined not to be dragged into another foreign catastrophe by bankers or politicians. Roosevelt needed a solution that did not look like charity, did not look like intervention, and did not look like war. What he needed was a story. From that necessity emerged the concept of Lend-Lease. When Roosevelt presented it to reporters, he framed it in deliberately simple terms. If a neighbour's house was on fire, you did not argue over the price of a garden hose. You lent him the hose, and when the fire was out, he returned it. It was a folksy metaphor, carefully chosen, designed to disarm suspicion and make intervention feel like common sense rather than foreign entanglement. But behind the closed doors of Washington, the reality was far colder. This was not a conversation between equals. It was a foreclosure. The man overseeing the process was Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., fiercely anti-fascist and personally sympathetic to Britain's plight. Morgenthau, nevertheless, had one overriding duty: protect American taxpayers. He was determined that the United States would not finance the war while Britain quietly preserved hidden wealth. Before a single dollar of aid would flow, Britain had to prove it was truly exhausted. Morgenthau demanded everything: full disclosure of every British asset, state-owned, privately held, domestic and overseas, factories, shipping firms, stock certificates, raw materials, even inventories of uniforms and shell casings. He wanted valuations. He wanted documentation. He wanted proof that nothing was being concealed. The British delegation, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, was stunned. They had come seeking partnership. Instead, they were being audited, treated not as comrades in arms, but as a failed enterprise under administration. Phillips protested. Britain had already shipped its gold across the Atlantic. Liquidating long-term investments during wartime would mean catastrophic losses. Worse still, stripping Britain of income-generating assets would leave the nation destitute after the war, unable to feed its people or rebuild its cities. In a tense meeting, Phillips's voice, usually measured, took on a desperate edge. "Mr. Secretary, you are asking us to burn the furniture to keep the house warm for one more night. What shall we sit on when the dawn comes?" Morgenthau, unmoved, leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "Sir Frederick, if the house burns down tonight, there will be no dawn to worry about. Show me the furniture, all of it." The audit that followed was an exercise in national humiliation, conducted via carbon-copied forms and invasive telegrams. Teams of American accountants, granted unprecedented access, descended upon British ministries. In the Board of Trade, a clerk named Ethelred was tasked for 3 sleepless weeks with cataloguing every overseas holding of British textile firms, mills in Bombay, plantations in the West Indies, distribution, networks in Buenos Aires. Each asset, many of which had been built over generations of Victorian ambition, was reduced to a serial number and an estimated dollar value on a spreadsheet headed liquidatable collateral. Sir Frederick Phillips, in a moment of private despair in his Washington hotel room, took out a personal ledger. On one side, he listed the tangible assets, viscose, gold, bases. On the other, he wrote the intangible costs, sovereignty, dignity, future. The first column had precise figures. The second column, he knew, was infinitely more expensive, but its price would only be revealed to his grandchildren. The audit was not merely assessing wealth, it was calibrating the exact point of a nation's breaking, the moment when pride would be overtaken by the primal need to survive. The reports that landed on Morgenthau's desk were not financial statements, they were a map of an empire's emptied veins. Morgenthau did not relent. His instructions from the WEII President were clear. America would help Britain, but only after Britain had bled itself dry. The logic was brutal but politically unassailable. Why should an Iowa farmer pay for a British tank if a British aristocrat still owned a profitable factory in New Jersey? Why should American workers sacrifice if British wealth remained untouched? Lend-Lease would not begin as a gift. It would begin as proof of ruin. The most wrenching symbol of this coerced divestment was the fate of the American Viscose Corporation. Towering over the industrial skyline of the United States, it was the world's largest producer of rayon and synthetic silk, a marvel of manufacturing scale and efficiency. Yet for Britain, it was more than a factory, it was a financial lifeline. Controlled by Courtaulds, a British firm, it generated millions of dollars in dividends every year, feeding directly into London's coffers and helping to offset the staggering trade imbalance created by the war. Henry Morgenthau singled it out. He issued a stark directive. Britain must divest the company. The proceeds would flow immediately into the US Treasury, financing arms, ammunition and aircraft for the British struggle. Resistance was instinctive but futile. The British negotiators understood that the enterprise was worth over $100 million, yet wartime exigencies offered them no choice. Selling it quickly meant economic self-destruction. Courtaulds would be paid, but only partially, in pounds back in London, inflating domestic debt and destabilising post-war recovery. The transaction was handled with ruthless efficiency by American bankers. Negotiations were perfunctory. The coerced sale netted roughly $54 million, a fraction of the company's true value. It was robbery executed under the guise of legality, a forced transfer masked as commerce. Britain had no leverage. Its very survival depended on compliance. In a sterile boardroom in New York, British representatives signed the papers. The scratch of the pen was the only sound. One of them, a man named Alistair Reid, who had helped broker the original investment decades before, later wrote in his diary, "We did not sell it. We surrendered it." It felt less like a business transaction and more like signing over the deed to a family home, while the bailiff stands at the door, holding a warrant for your arrest. The Americans were polite, even apologetic, but their politeness was the most humiliating part. Bandits, at least, have the decency to wear masks. Sunday, March 15th, 1941, became a date that British financial authorities would never forget. American viscose was stripped from Courtaulds' hands under wartime emergency authority. There was no consultation, no debate, only execution. The dollars flowed into the United States, immediately converting British vulnerability into American strategic advantage. This divestment marked a turning point. The British leadership grasped, in that single act, the true cost of their so-called special relationship with the United States. They were not partners, they were debtors, they were being stripped, asset by asset, to fund their own survival. The United States, in quiet bureaucratic precision, was absorbing the wealth of the British Empire, not by force of arms, but through the relentless logic of finance. For Britain, it was a bitter lesson. Survival came at the expense of sovereignty. Each factory, each dividend, each ounce of gold was not simply spent, it was surrendered, consumed in a transaction that secured not just the present, but the permanent subordination of economic independence. But the erosion of Britain's empire extended far beyond factories and corporate holdings. It seeped into the very foundations of global strategy, the lifeblood of naval power, the arteries of trade, and the outposts that had safeguarded the empire for centuries. While financial delegates bickered over share values and dividends, another agreement was quietly forged, one that would shift the balance of the Atlantic and Caribbean forever. Britain desperately needed destroyers. German U-boats prowled the seas with lethal efficiency, sinking cargo ships faster than British shipyards could replace them. Every convoy was a gamble, every passage across the Atlantic a deadly lottery. Churchill, ever precise in his appeals, implored Roosevelt for 50 aging destroyers, vessels left in mothballs after the First World War, corroded and obsolete, scarcely seaworthy. Yet even these relics were worth gold to Britain, for the Atlantic lifeline was a lifeline of survival. Roosevelt consented, but not freely, not without terms. The transfer of the destroyers was bartered, an exchange cloaked in diplomacy, but rooted in strategic opportunism. In return for 50 deteriorating ships, the United States acquired 99-year leases on British bases stretching across the Western Hemisphere, Newfoundland, and Canada, the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. These were no trivial outposts. They were keys to the Atlantic, to the Caribbean, to global influence. Britain surrendered control of its territories to secure immediate survival. Admiral Sir Sidney Bailey, tasked with overseeing the handover of the Bermuda facilities, stood on the dock as the American flag was raised. A stiff Atlantic breeze snapped the Stars and Stripes taut. To his aid, he murmured, not with anger, but with the hollow tone of a historian witnessing an epoch end. There, do you see it? That isn't a flag. It's a receipt. The bases were more than land. They were chess pieces on the global board, and Britain was being forced to forfeit its queenside in a desperate bid to save its king. Consider the magnitude. Britain, a nation that had ruled the seas for centuries, was trading sovereignty for obsolescent metal. It was the behaviour of a desperate house selling its heirlooms to buy food. The Lend-Lease Act, when passed in March 1941, was publicly celebrated as a grand gesture, the arsenal of democracy at work. It supplied tanks, planes, fuel, and provisions. Yet beneath the public celebration lay a truth few acknowledged. The act did not donate wealth, it rented it. Britain's treasury, stripped bare, became a conduit for American strategic and economic ascendancy. The empire had secured survival, but at the cost of its assets, its leverage, and its future. As the months turned to years, the Atlantic lifeline flowed with unprecedented urgency. British factories converted to military production, producing Spitfires and Hurricanes, while American plants churned out aircraft, vehicles, and radios for worldwide consumption. The economic gap widened. Britain fought and endured, but America's industrial engine, untouched by bombs, unshackled by rationing, expanded beyond imagining. The war was a crucible, and in its fire, the British Empire's commercial and strategic foundations were quietly being handed to the United States. The consequences of Lend-Lease reached even deeper than factories, ports, and naval bases. Buried within the dense legal phrasing of the pact was Article 7, a seemingly small clause with catastrophic implications. To the casual observer, it was bureaucratic verbiage. To Britain, it was an economic guillotine. Article 7 required Britain to commit after the war to abolish the imperial preference system. This was no trivial matter. Imperial preference had long bound the empire together in a delicate lattice of commerce and protection. Tariffs and trade policies ensured that goods from the dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, India, were cheaper within empire markets than those from foreign competitors. British factories survived against superior rivals through this protective shield. It was the mortar holding the empire's economic walls intact. By endorsing Article 7, Britain was pledging to dismantle its own defences. It was agreeing to expose its industries to unfettered American competition, to surrender the preferential system that had allowed empire manufacturers to thrive for centuries. The British delegates recognised the existential stakes. They understood that agreeing would not just erode profits, it would signal the end of economic autonomy for the empire. Yet they had no choice. Lord Halifax, the British ambassador in Washington, penned a secret dispatch to London. His words were stark. They are asking for the keys to the family business, not to manage it, but to dismantle the front door so that their goods may forever flow in unhindered. We are signing a contract that guarantees our salvation this winter, and our impoverishment for every winter that follows. He signed it, then stared at the document, knowing it was a diagnosis of a terminal condition. German aircraft roared overhead. U-boats prowled the Atlantic like hungry predators. Britain's gold was gone. Its investments were being liquidated. Its strategic bases ceded. Survival was non-negotiable. The delegates fought fiercely in meetings, their voices straining against the inexorable logic of circumstance. But in the end, survival demanded acquiescence. As 1941 turned into 1942 and the United States entered the war following Pearl Harbor, the military balance shifted decisively. American troops poured into Britain. Airfields became massive launch platforms, factories expanded, and convoys bristled with men and material. But the economic gulf only widened. American manufacturing, fueled by state expenditure and unscathed by bombing, surged exponentially. Britain's economy, meanwhile, remained confined and exhausted, producing only what the war machine demanded. Its factories churned Spitfires. American plants churned Spitfires alongside refrigerators, radios, and automobiles for a hungry global market. Britain's economic sovereignty was diminishing even as its military endurance remained heroic. The cost of Article 7 was not immediate, but it was inevitable. It etched into history a moment when Britain, the empire that had commanded oceans and commerce for centuries, agreed to restructure its economic identity under duress. Survival demanded compromise, but compromise came at the expense of tomorrow. By 1944, the transformation was complete. The gold reserves that had once gleamed in London's vaults had been shipped across the Atlantic to Fort Knox. The financial pivot of the world had shifted. Britain's coffers were empty, its overseas holdings diminished, its industrial and strategic assets stripped bare, yet the most profound degradation, the reckoning, still lay ahead. For 2 years, Britain had fought alone against the Nazi juggernaut. It had endured the Blitz, weathered the U-boat siege, and maintained the Atlantic lifeline at staggering cost. The British leadership had believed that their sacrifice, their endurance, would earn them respect and partnership in the post-war order. They trusted that Lend-Lease, which had been a lifeline during the darkest hours, would continue into a recovery phase, offering a buffer to transition from war to peace. They were wrong. The world did not pause to honour their heroism. 7 days after the war's final gunfire had silenced, President Harry Truman signed a directive that would strike the British economy with greater force than any German bomb. Lend-Lease, the lifeblood that had sustained Britain, was terminated, instantly, totally. There was no gradual reduction, no phased withdrawal. Liberty ships laden with grain, meat, machinery and equipment destined for Liverpool were ordered to reverse course, to return to American ports. The supply line that had sustained a nation through famine, fire and siege was cut. In Liverpool's bustling port, a crane operator named Bill watched as a ship that had been halfway through unloading frozen beef suddenly stopped. American sailors, their faces tight with embarrassment or indifference, began resecuring the cargo. Orders from Washington, was all the foreman said, shrugging. Bill thought of his family, of the meagre rations that wouldn't stretch now. The war was over, but the hunger, it seemed, was just beginning in a new, more bewildering form. The betrayal wasn't in the bombs, it was in the recalled beef. The shockwave of the termination rippled out from the docks into the very fabric of British society. At the Rover plant in Solihull, where they had been transitioning back to making cars, managers were told that the shipment of American machine tools vital for retooling had been cancelled. The promise of peacetime jobs evaporated overnight. In hospitals, administrators received notices that expected shipments of penicillin and new surgical equipment from the US would not arrive. Medical care, which had advanced under the brutal pressures of war, would now regress under the pressures of peace, but the deepest cut was nutritional. The Ministry of Food had built its entire 1945 recovery plan on the expected continuation of Lend-Lease protein sources, the powdered eggs, the tinned pork, the Canadian wheat. With the pipeline severed, officials faced a monstrous equation. The national calorie count dropped by a third overnight. Rationing, which people had hoped would ease, tightened like a vice. The peace ration was smaller than the war ration. Housewives queuing with their green ration books felt a new, more confusing kind of betrayal. The enemy had surrendered, but the daily struggle had intensified. A profound, weary bitterness set in. They had given their iron railings, their fathers, their sons, their sleepless nights in shelters. Now, it seemed, they were being asked to give their futures too, meal by meagre meal. The spirit of the Blitz, that defiant, communal endurance, curdled into a sullen, isolated resentment. The war had unified them. Against a visible enemy, the peace was dividing them against an invisible ledger. The British authorities were paralysed. They had assumed that the American alliance, forged in the crucible of survival, would allow them time to adapt, to rebuild, to transition into peacetime without catastrophe. Instead, they faced a vacuum. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's preeminent economist, a man whose intellect had guided the nation through financial storms, stared at the figures and beheld a void deeper than any battlefield trench. Britain was insolvent, not gradually, not over months, but immediately. Half of Britain's food, nearly all raw materials, had flowed in through Lend-Lease funding. Without it, the nation faced an economic Dunkirk. Factories would falter, joblessness would surge, food shortages would worsen, social unrest loomed. There was only one recourse: Britain had to plead. And so, in September 1945, a gravely ill John Maynard Keynes embarked for Washington. His heart was failing, his body drained, yet he carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. He did not travel as a scholar or advisor. He travelled as a beggar, seeking mercy from a nation that had once been his partner. Keynes arrived in Washington carrying more than documents. He carried the weight of a nation's honour and survival. He had expected reason, he had expected fairness, he had expected recognition of Britain's sacrifice. Instead, he found a dispassionate, methodical bureaucracy, prepared to apply pressure with the precision of a scalpel. The war had ended, and with it, any notion that America would continue sustaining Britain out of necessity. Now, it was business, cold, calculated, and unyielding. 7 days after the victory, celebrations erupted across London. The crowds outside Buckingham Palace cheering, bonfires blazing, strangers embracing. Truman's administration acted decisively. The Lend-Lease lifeline was severed, and Britain's precarious economy felt the shock immediately. Ships carrying essential supplies reversed course mid-Atlantic. Grain, meat, machinery, and equipment destined for British ports were recalled to the United States. The nation had prepared for peacetime transition, but that bridge was gone. Keynes, the architect of economic stability during the war, was stunned. Britain had been drained, stripped of assets, and now the lifeline that had prevented famine, maintained production, and kept social order was abruptly cut. He recognized the severity instantly. Without continued American support, Britain would be unable to import food, fuel, or raw materials. Factories would halt, joblessness would soar, rationing, already harsh during wartime, would become extreme, society risked collapse. Faced with this reality, Keynes took on a new role. He would plead, negotiate, and bargain with a Washington that no longer treated Britain as a partner. His first meeting was with Treasury Secretary Fred Vinson, a man from Kentucky with the demeanour of a granite cliff. Keynes, with his aristocratic Cambridge accent and towering intellect, laid out his moral case. The 2 years Britain stood alone, the wealth expended, the blood sacrificed. Vinson listened, chewed on an unlit cigar, and when Keynes finished, he removed the cigar and said flatly, "Professor, that's a real pretty story, but we're not in the story business. We're in the loan business. What collateral have you got left?" In that moment, Keynes understood that heroism had no line item in an American balance sheet. He carried with him the argument of justice, 2 years of solitary resistance, the preservation of Western civilization, and the sacrifice of national wealth should merit recompense, not further deprivation. He requested a grant, not a loan, $6 billion to compensate Britain for the cost of holding the front. But the Americans, led by Treasury officials such as Fred Vinson, had little interest in justice. They saw leverage, and they applied it without hesitation. To them, Britain was not a sovereign partner, but a debtor, vulnerable and dependent. Their message was blunt and unambiguous. There would be no gift, no grant, only a loan, strictly on market terms, with interest, and with conditions designed to preserve American advantage. Keynes, exhausted and ailing, realized that even the lifeline he had so carefully negotiated during the war would now become a trap, one that would shape Britain's economy for decades. Keynes believed in the righteousness of his argument. He intended to stand in the offices of the US Treasury and deliver a clear moral case. Britain had fought alone for 2 years, while America remained neutral. Britain had sacrificed its entire economy to safeguard Western civilization. Surely that deserved recompense, not a loan, but a grant. He called it justice. He called it recognition for endurance. He called it repayment for heroism. But in Washington, justice was not currency. The atmosphere was clinical, cold, and devoid of sentiment. Congressional leaders were wary, distrustful of Britain's new Labour government, elected on socialist promises, fearing the misuse of American taxpayer money. They were determined to treat Britain as a debtor, not an ally. Keynes encountered icy stares from Fred Vinson and other officials. There was no appeal to morality, only to leverage. The negotiations were held in airless rooms, where the only breeze came from the turning pages of legal pads. American lawyers spoke of consideration and amortization, while Keynes spoke of the moral debt of freedom. The disconnect was absolute. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Keynes confided to a British aide, his voice a thin whisper of exhaustion. "They speak of us as if we are a bankrupt railway company, not the nation that held the line for them. We are not negotiating a loan, we are witnessing an autopsy, and they are insisting we pay for the scalpel." Negotiations were brutal. Keynes argued, pleaded and debated, emphasizing the consequences of a broken British economy, global instability, social unrest, and diminished capacity to counter the growing Soviet threat. Yet the Americans held every advantage. Britain had nowhere else to turn, and the Treasury knew it. The terms offered were merciless. A loan of $3.75 billion, scarcely enough to sustain immediate survival, and laden with conditions that would choke British economic autonomy. Every provision, every clause, was designed to preserve American leverage. Keynes had no choice but to accept. It was a bitter capitulation. The most toxic requirement was sterling convertibility. The Americans insisted that within 1 year of accepting the loan, Britain must make the pound sterling fully convertible. To the untrained eye, it seemed a step toward free trade, a benign liberalization of the global economy. In reality, it was an economic trap. During the war, Britain had maintained a closed system. Its colonies and partners could trade only in pounds, preserving a protective shield for British products. Convertibility would unleash a flood. Keynes understood immediately. The moment the pound became convertible, every holder of British currency worldwide, India, Australia, Egypt, any nation with sterling reserves, would rush to exchange them for US dollars. The outflow would be instantaneous, overwhelming, and catastrophic. The very loan designed to sustain Britain would be drained within weeks, leaving the nation exposed to famine, unemployment, and collapse. Despite his failing health, despite a heart weakened by decades of relentless work, Keynes resisted. He fought to shield Britain from financial annihilation, knowing the implications were existential, but he could not overcome the leverage that America wielded. Reluctantly, bitterly, the British Parliament approved the loan. The pact was executed in July 1946, and within months, Keynes himself passed away, his heart succumbing to the strain of trying to save his nation from its nearest partner. The news of his death reached London as the first payments came due. For those who understood, it felt symbolic. The mine that had fought so brilliantly for Britain's economic independence had been extinguished by the very battle he could not win. The victory in Europe had been secured on the battlefield. Yet the war for Britain's economic sovereignty had been lost in Washington, in those quiet rooms where the weapons were not tanks but terms. Keynes returned to England a spectre of his former self. The Atlantic crossing was a physical agony. His heart, strained beyond repair, fluttered weakly against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was met at Southampton by his wife Lydia, who saw the defeat in his sunken eyes before he spoke a word. At their home in Tilton, he retired to his study, not to work, but to stare at the Sussex Downs. The Mall. Rolling green hills, the very picture of enduring England, felt like a cruel illusion. He had out-argued the greatest economic minds of his generation, but he could not out-argue raw power. He drafted one final unsent letter to an American colleague. In it, he abandoned all economic jargon. "We have been made supplicants," he wrote, his handwriting, once florid and confident, now a frail scrawl. "Not for arms to defend our shores, but for bread to feed our children after the defence succeeded. The principle they have established is a dangerous one, that the victor shall pay tribute to the bystander. We saved the free world with our last sovereign, and our reward is to be indentured to our salvation." He set down his pen. The terms he had signed would force Britain to dismantle the very economic defences he had spent a lifetime advocating for. The Keynesian state, born of the war, was to be strangled in its crib by the peace. He died not from a disease of the heart, but from a broken one. The most poisonous clause of the American loan, the demand for sterling convertibility, was about to exact its full toll. On July 15, 1947, the British government complied. It had no alternative. The pound sterling, once a bastion of imperial financial control, was now open to global exchange. Any holder of sterling could enter a bank anywhere in the world and convert it to US dollars. At first, the action seemed procedural, almost abstract, but the consequences were immediate and devastating. Nations that had accumulated sterling reserves during the war, India, Australia, Egypt, and countless others, did not hesitate. The floodgates opened, pounds were sold, traded, and exchanged for American dollars with feverish urgency. In the span of mere weeks, the funds that had been painstakingly marshalled to sustain Britain's recovery began to evaporate. The American loan, intended to ensure a stable transition from war to peace, was drained at an astonishing rate. The British authorities watched in horror as reserves dwindled, their financial lifeline hemorrhaging before their eyes. In the Treasury's chart room, a young clerk named Arthur was tasked with updating a large map with pins representing Britain's dollar reserves. Each morning, he would move a cluster of pins from the available column to the expended column. The pace began as a steady trickle. After convertibility, it became a rout. He'd walk in to find his supervisor's ashen face, and would move entire handfuls of pins at once, the tiny metal heads cold and sharp against his fingers, a tactile representation of national dissolution. "It's like watching a tide go out," he wrote to his brother, and realising it's not coming back. $500 million vanished within the first month alone. By August 20th, 1947, only 5 weeks after convertibility, the government was compelled to halt the process. They closed the gates, desperate, humiliated, and forced to approach the United States Treasury in complete surrender. The plan to follow American dictates, to align with the conditions of the loan, had backfired catastrophically. Britain had attempted to comply, to preserve honour and continuity, but the result was absolute degradation. The empire, once a global hegemon with financial leverage reaching across continents, had been stripped to its barest essentials. Its industrial power, its gold reserves, its strategic influence, even its ability to feed and supply its population, were now dictated by Washington. Victory had been achieved on the battlefield, yet economic collapse loomed. The nation's moral and military triumph was in stark contrast with its financial impotence. For ordinary Britons, the post-war reality was harsh and immediate. Rationing persisted, even intensified. Coal shortages froze factories and homes. Power outages became commonplace. The infrastructure that had been sustained by Lend-Lease could no longer function reliably. Britain had fought and endured, but the price of victory had been the systematic surrender of its economic autonomy. The empire had survived the war, but it had been auctioned off piece by piece, its wealth transferred across the Atlantic to secure survival and appease a dominant ally. It was a bitter paradox. The nation had saved Western civilization, yet in doing so had mortgaged its own future. The winter of 1947 arrived like a white iron fist, the harshest in memory. Snowstorms buried the land under a suffocating blanket. Roads disappeared beneath drifts. Railways froze. Coal reserves, already depleted, became solid blocks of ice. Power plants shuttered. Factories ground to a halt. In homes across the country, citizens huddled around meagre fires, burning candles to fend off the cold, whispering prayers over rations that were shrinking despite the nation's heroic efforts during the war. It was in this bitter gloom that the full reality of Britain's post-war victory struck. They had triumphed against Hitler. They had endured the Blitz. They had preserved civilization itself. And yet, their quality of life had collapsed. The victory parades and bonfires outside Buckingham Palace had been ephemeral moments of ecstasy. Now, the harsh arithmetic of survival returned with a vengeance. Bread, once plentiful even under siege, was rationed. Coal was rationed. Heat was rationed. The era of austerity, imposed not by enemies, but by necessity, had begun. In a terraced house in Manchester, the Hadley family burned books to keep a single room lukewarm. The father, a veteran of El Alamein, stared at the flames consuming a volume of Dickens. "We beat the Nazis to burn our own libraries," he said to his wife, his voice empty. The cold was more than a physical sensation. It was a metaphysical chill, the deep freeze of a national dream deferred. The enemy was gone, but the peace felt like a quieter, more enduring siege. And then came the ultimate blow. On July the 15th, 1947, as mandated by the loan terms, Britain made the pound sterling fully convertible. Keynes had predicted the disaster, now it unfolded with brutal precision. The gates opened and the world rushed to offload pounds in exchange for dollars. The American loan, carefully negotiated and intended to sustain the country through recovery, was drained in weeks. Hundreds of millions vanished. The reserves that had been the bedrock of Britain's survival disappeared almost overnight. Authorities watched in stunned disbelief as the hemorrhage accelerated. The carefully built financial scaffolding that had supported industry, rationing and social stability began to crumble. Within 5 weeks, by August 20th, 1947, convertibility was halted. Britain was forced to confess defeat, to appeal once more to the United States for stabilization. The nation had followed the conditions imposed upon it meticulously, and yet the results were catastrophic. This episode revealed the harshest lesson of all. Military triumph did not guarantee economic security. The British Empire had endured, but it had been mortgaged, its autonomy sacrificed to satisfy external imperatives. Citizens shivered in cold homes, factories remained silent, and the society that had held firm under bombs now strained under financial suffocation. Victory had come at a price far higher than guns, bullets, or lives. It was a toll measured in the loss of national independence, in the surrender of the economic legacy built over centuries. The empire had survived the storm of war, but it had been systematically weakened, its economic lifeblood redirected across the Atlantic. Triumph had been preserved in glory, but not in gold. The economic collapse produced immediate and profound geopolitical consequences. Britain, once the global arbiter of power, was now forced to acknowledge its limits. In February 1947, London dispatched a confidential note to the US State Department, a missive almost unthinkable in its frankness. It was, in essence, a declaration of surrender. For more than a century, Britain had safeguarded Greece and Turkey, keeping Soviet ambitions at bay in the eastern Mediterranean. Now, with empty coffers and exhausted resources, it could no longer maintain troops, provide financial support, or influence the region's fragile stability. The note was terse and undeniable. "We are bankrupt. We are withdrawing. If you wish to contain the communists, you must act." Britain, the island that had dominated oceans and commerce, was formally passing the torch. The United States, already the world's rising industrial and financial colossus, stepped into the vacuum. The American diplomat who received the note, Dean Acheson, understood its seismic weight immediately. He later wrote that it was the moment the scepter passed. There was no ceremony, no treaty signing, just a piece of paper that admitted that the sun was finally setting on the British Empire, not because it had been defeated, but because it could no longer afford the dawn. The Truman Doctrine, America's formal commitment to contain Soviet expansion, was born directly from this British abdication. An empire's bankruptcy became a superpower's founding doctrine. This marked the official recognition that Britain was no longer a dominant global power. It was a local power, struggling to maintain influence while simultaneously attempting to survive economically. Domestically, the impact was devastating. Even as the nation sought to rebuild, the fiscal strain persisted. By 1949, the British economy, still deformed by war expenditure, exhausted reserves, and forced loans, was forced into drastic action. Authorities devalued the pound sterling. Before the war, the pound had been worth £4.86. Post-devaluation, it fell to £2.80. Overnight, the British populace was effectively 30% poorer relative to the global economy. Imports became prohibitively expensive. Everyday goods rose in cost. Living standards, already strained by rationing and austerity, suffered further blows. But the ultimate toll was generational. The Anglo-American loan of 1946, borrowed to prevent Britain from starving after victory, was not a gift. It was a binding obligation with interest, stretching across decades. Each year, for 6 long decades, the British Treasury made payments to the United States, servicing the debt contracted to survive. Through the post-war boom of the 1950s, the economic stagnation of the 1970s, and the ideological and political upheavals of the Thatcher and Blair eras, the payments persisted. The final instalment did not occur until December 29, 2006, a stark testament to how the cost of war had reverberated across generations. On that final day in 2000, a routine transaction was processed in a Treasury computer system. No bells rang, no announcements were made. The last of the debt from the Second World War, were won over 60 years prior, was cleared. A young civil servant, born in the 1980s, might have seen the code for the transaction flash on a screen, utterly unaware that it represented the closing of a ledger, opened in the fear and fire of the Blitz, negotiated in the desperate illness of John Maynard Keynes. The war's longest battle was over, settled not with a ceasefire, but with a silent digital transfer. This was the real price of triumph. The guns fell silent in 1945, but the echoes of financial subjugation lingered for 61 years. Military victory had preserved Britain's sovereignty momentarily, but economic sovereignty had been sacrificed entirely. Consider that for a moment. 60 years after the guns fell silent, 60 years after the victory marches and the bonfires, British citizens were still paying the cost of having endured World War II. The sacrifices, the heroism, the courage that had defined the nation's war effort were undeniable, but the economics, consequences lingered across generations. This is the definitive lesson of the cost of triumph, that wars, even those won, can leave victors impoverished. Germany had lost the war and been shattered. Britain had won, yet it too had been dismantled, piece by piece, dollar by dollar. The only true beneficiary of the conflict beyond the battlefield was the United States. Its manufacturing base had expanded unscathed by bombs. Its economy doubled in scale. Its industries, fueled by both war production and post-war financing, emerged stronger than ever. Through the instruments of Lend-Lease and the post-war loans, the US effectively dismantled the trade privileges of the British Empire, opening global markets for American goods. The United States did not conquer the British Empire with armies, tanks, or naval bombardments. It acquired it with leverage, with contracts, with legal instruments and financial dominance. It absorbed Britain's holdings, its facilities, its economic sway, not by force of arms, but by exercising the advantages of credit and control. The empire remained intact politically, but economically it had been subordinated. For the British populace, the legacy of 1941 remained as a quiet wound on the national spirit. It nurtured a sense of dissent, a perception that the nation's peak days lay behind it. It reinforced a special relationship with the United States, a relationship always polite, always courteous, yet fundamentally asymmetrical, rooted in dependency, not equality. This dynamic played out in 1,000 subtle ways. In joint military operations, American commanders held ultimate logistical authority. In intelligence sharing, the flow was never quite equal. In diplomatic crises, Britain's voice was respected, but it was the American position that set the course. The special relationship was a pillar of post-war policy, but it was a pillar supporting a structure designed and largely owned by another. Britain had a privileged seat at the table, but the menu and the bill were determined in Washington. When Winston Churchill penned that desperate letter to Franklin Roosevelt in December 1940, he saved his nation from Hitler. But in the same act, he signed an invisible document of transfer. He bartered an empire's wealth, its global influence, and the future prosperity of its people for survival. It was a transaction with no alternative, a cost too high to avoid, yet unavoidable nonetheless. Britain emerged from the war as a moral titan, a defender of liberty, a beacon of endurance. But economically, it was a dwarf. Its legacy, its heritage, its financial independence had been spent to secure the present. It was, in every sense, a heroic offering, perhaps the most heroic in recorded history. Yet in the unforgiving calculus of economics, it was a clearance sale. Victory had been preserved, liberty had been secured, but the empire had been auctioned, fragment by fragment, to pay the price of doing what was right. History remembers battles, generals, and nations that stood against tyranny, yet beneath the surface, in ledgers and contracts, in financial transfers and forced divestments, the true story of power, survival, and sacrifice was written. Britain had triumphed in war, but at a cost that would echo for generations. So what was truly purchased with those final payments in 2006? It was not just a discharge of a financial obligation, it was the closing of a psychic account. The unspoken understanding that Britain was a junior partner, the quiet acceptance of a diminished horizon, the cultural reflex of austerity, these were the enduring legacies, far outlasting the debt itself. The post-war generations inherited not just a rebuilt nation, but a subconscious narrative of decline. The great in Great Britain became less a statement of present fact and more a memorial to past stature. The story of Lend-Lease and the Anglo-American loan is the story of the 20th century's pivotal transaction. It demonstrates that empires can fall not with a bang, but with a signature, that the most effective conquests happen not on battlefields, but in Treasury bond markets, and that the price of standing alone against tyranny is forever after to never be able to stand entirely alone again. Britain won its finest hour, but the meter for that hour, it turned out, was still running 6 decades later. The ultimate cost of triumph was to make the victor a permanent client of the new world it had been instrumental in creating. The war ended. The installment plan, for the very soul of an empire, lasted a lifetime. So the next time you hear about the special relationship, or see a photograph of Churchill and Roosevelt together, remember the story that isn't in the frame. Remember the gold in the ship's hold, the signature on the divestment papers, the quiet click of a Treasury computer finalizing a payment in 2006. This wasn't just history, it was a transaction, a lesson written not in treaties, but in ledgers, a reminder that the price of victory can be a debt that outlives the veterans, the statesmen, and the very world order they fought to save. Thank you for watching. If this story changed your perspective, share it with someone who needs to understand that sometimes the most profound battles are fought not for territory, but for economic sovereignty, and that those battles can last long after the peace is declared.